Welcome to this Q&A video. I had masses of questions, relatively speaking anyway, 23 at the point where I collected them on Tuesday morning. Apologies if you submitted one after that. 10 of those questions came from Patreon supporters, so all of those will get covered, and then I'll try to cover as many of the others that I can. Lots of interesting ones, so let's dive straight in. My stepson, who has recently been to university and is very anti-Western woke, characterises free speech advocates as intolerant bigots like Piers Morgan. Do you think some people use free speech arguments as an excuse to be boorish? Well, of course, but then there are boorish people lined up behind most positions. The question is whether you assume that people holding a specific position are fairly represented by the worst of those who hold the same position, or if they should all be taken on their own merits. There's a well-known psychological thing that we all do, which is that we all see all the differences and the nuances between the people in our own tribe, but we assume the people on the other side, well, they're all the same, and we make assumptions about them based on the worst of them. Now, the daft thing is to do that about an issue such as free speech, which belongs to neither left nor to right, and has been held as being important by both. When I first became aware of free speech, it was in relation to the fatwa against Salman Rushdie and the disgraceful failure by certain conservative politicians to defend him, although the state as a whole did. They didn't support him because they probably saw him in the same allegedly boorish guise that your stepson sees Piers Morgan. So it's just as well to try to separate the worst of the advocates from whether or not the issue is valid. Free speech has been very important to the left in the past, and no doubt it will become so again at some point again in the future. How can democracy survive when the quality of politicians is so poor? I don't entirely agree with the question. I would say the quality of politicians is variable. In any case, the system often has hidden resilience because people of competence out of the spotlight hold things together in times of stress, even when the people in office aren't exactly an asset. And so far, electorates tend towards common sense, realising when they've made a mistake and they should make a change. That said, I do think that with advances in neuropsychology and artificial intelligence and all of the rest, there are actors today targeting those things that make democracies vulnerable, stoking up internal division and misinformation and the like, and doing so very effectively. And not even just the malign forces, just the way social media is working and pushing people out to the extremes. Those are taking democracies to the brink. Now, poor quality leaders and politicians generally might well be incapable of rising to that challenge. The thing that they have on their side is the fact that the alternatives, authoritarians, dictatorships and the like, they have their own fatal flaws built into their system. So it's an entirely open question which systems survive the stress test of modern conflict better. I can imagine upheavals in the future of democracies. Mostly they're going to be about replacing one leader with another. Well, here's another related question. How can the USA lance the Stop the Steal boil, i.e. restore its citizens' faith in the validity of its electoral process/voting system? I've been thinking about doing a full video on this. What would it take? In short, you need a system that both sides will consider to be robust. I mean, the UK has had arguments and disputes, but we've never seen the total lack of faith in an outcome of an election that the USA has had. And that's because our system is pretty robust. The questions just don't arise. Now, the problem with the USA, the polarisation in how this issue is discussed, it isn't just about how it can be made tamper-proof, but lots of other things are being thrown in, such as if voting doesn't extend to this time frame, then it's racist, because it doesn't suit communities of colour. Obviously, there are certain barriers you could erect, but mostly these discussions are about parties trying to manipulate the rules to maximise their own benefit, and that's why it's so fraught. There probably needs to be a cross-party independent body made up of individuals that both parties commit to support that comes up with a framework for how elections are conducted, how they're monitored, and how they're verified. I suppose coming up with that as a solution might require better politicians than the ones you've got, which sort of proves the previous questioner's point. Harvard University is planning geoengineering. The idea is to revert to pre-industrial climate. My question is, What did pre-industrial climate look like, and what were the living conditions at the time? Something that worries me is the suspicion that this is what led to all the turmoil of the French Revolution, Napoleon's Wars, Russian Revolution, etc. So I covered the Harvard Plan in detail in a separate video. I'll say one thing about that, which is that it isn't going to happen in my lifetime. They've said that the aim is to do the research to establish if it could work and what would be the impact and how you'd have to do it and all that. And they're suggesting that we should do that research even though the intent is not to do that, because one day we may find we've messed things up so badly that we have to do it. And at least then we'll know what we're doing, not just doing things in a panic that haven't been well worked through, which is fine. But we had well worked through plans of how we would deal with a pandemic. A couple of years ago, the US and the UK were rated in the top rank of preparedness for such an eventuality. Having those plans doesn't always mean a lot when you get to the crunch. Now, what you say, which is that it's aimed to push us to the pre-industrial age, well, the first thing to note is that that's not possible. Because pre-industrial, the climate was shaped by the solar input that we had and the level of greenhouse gases that we had, obviously the key variable being CO2. You can't exactly recreate that with an alternative that's enhanced levels of CO2 but a filter applied to the solar input. You may get a cooler average global temperature that way, but we don't know whether it would climatically be the same as the past if you did that, because the circumstances are not identical. If it was the same, then you return to a state where the climate can be favourable or it can be not. Does that mean then, as you suggest, we would recreate the drought and the famine that partly led to the French Revolution? Well, I doubt it. For the same reason why I don't go with the climate catastrophists about future famine to the short medium term in our current situation. We have much more resilient systems than we had in those times. Better interconnectedness, better technology, massively higher adaptability. The dangers of a geoengineering project are the unforeseen changes that might take us out of that normal range, not simply that would return us to what we had, and that is a serious concern. Back in the day, one of the main concerns with nuclear energy was how to deal with the radioactive waste. No one seems to be talking about that now. Has it been solved? Was it ever really an issue? They're not talking about it because right now there are a few places where we're expanding nuclear power, I would expect anyway. In the early debates, I would say the concern about waste was entirely justified. The idea you commit yourself to looking after something on massive timescales, I mean longer than recorded history, it's a huge commitment. We resolve the short-term issues well enough. It hasn't been a visible issue in recent times. And the fourth generation nuclear technologies are much better in not producing high-grade radioactive waste. In fact, certain aspects may actually be able to use such waste as fuel, which would be a big problem solved right then. Will we invest in those technologies and push them to scale? That's a good question. Now, a couple of Brexit questions. The first was very long, but here's the first paragraph, and I answer it informed by having read the whole thing. I will try to reflect that. Looking from the outside, the support for Brexit is rather puzzling, to me at least, and I have not heard a satisfactory, non-emotional argument about how it benefits the UK in the long run. I may be wrong, but my sense is that Mallen is sympathetic to at least some of the Brexit sentiments. Now that some time has passed, I would love to hear a reasoned overview of the pros and cons. Well, if you listen to both sides of polarised debates, you can usually come to an understanding that makes you respectful of positions that others dismiss. In the audio podcast I did a couple of years ago, I interviewed David Goodhart and I interviewed Claire Fox, who are two of the more articulate Brexit supporters. Although we did specifically focus on Brexit in those interviews, Goodhart's book, The Road to Somewhere, described the divide, saying that divided Britain wasn't anymore about left versus right, but now it was about anywheres and somewheres. Anywheres were the elites, the internationalists, the university graduates, people who mostly led the country, whichever party they belonged to, and who were the people who were happy to live wherever they found themselves. Then you had the somewheres, people who were of the place where they lived, probably where they were born, who cared about their local community, less highly educated, maybe focused more on practical skills than with academia. And those people were cheesed off with having their outlook dismissed, being looked down on, called racists or Luddites. And Brexit was the roar of those people who saw their communities being changed too quickly for comfort, and those who felt that in such a transformation something important was being lost. And that, I think, has been the essence of Trumpism, in spite of the brash facade and a lot of the pushback in other countries as well. We got our first environmental legislation from locally enforced property rights, people caring for their own environment and their own community. The globalist framework aspires to deal with global problems, but it shows no signs of being effective at that. And you run the risk of losing the connectedness to what makes communities work on the ground. Communities are not just collections of people, just as nations are not collections of people. There has to be something that holds them together, with which they self-identify. In theory, Europe was the layer that fitted over the top of that. But its growing influence into all corners and its lack of democratic accountability and its ambition for ever closer political union, the somewheres in the country felt that that was a step too far. The recent issues with vaccines hasn't, of course, persuaded any of them that they were wrong. Indeed, the latest poll shows that support for the EU across the wider population has significantly declined. Now, in your question, you asked about a number of practical aspects, and this is part of the difference between the two. The anywheres, the internationalist elites, if you will, focus on the practicalities of what will be the impact on the economy, etc., etc. The somewheres focus on identity, sense of self, grounded in a sense of place. Identity trumps pragmatic arguments every time. Max Taibbi has stated Cambridge Analytica had nothing to do with Brexit. I saw the HBO movie on Dominic Cummings. So, do we have proof the Cambridge Analytica stuff was a lie when it comes to influencing Brexit? If I was doing a video, I would research that fully, so anything I say here is qualified because I haven't done that. I did follow it at the time, and a while ago I read Cummings' blogs on the subject. My understanding is that it was shown that the Vote Leave campaign did not use Cambridge Analytica. They produced a proposal that they sent to Cummings. He didn't take them up on it. They did do lots of smart targeting, sending messages to people that they thought were good fits for those that would respond to those messages. And, you know, that's just good campaigning. There's no evidence that anything was done that went beyond that. You have to remember that the Remainers were as devastated by the Brexit vote as the Democrats were by Trump's election in 2016. And up to the last, they had expected to win. The polls told them they were going to win. So when they lost, they couldn't conceive that they could have lost fair and square. And they did everything they could to find the illegitimate factor they felt must be at the heart of why they'd lost. Now, that doesn't mean that they can't be right. Always look at the evidence. But there's plenty that we've seen about how people lie to pollsters about the positions that are considered to be socially unacceptable, and yet there are powerful feelings and backlash about some of the things that are being taken for granted. You know, we've seen these things now a number of times. I'm not sure you need more than that to explain what happened. But obviously people would prefer there was a reason as to why they were robbed, rather than why they might have lost fair and square. Both sides are capable of that reaction, as we've seen recently in the US. Actually, let me pause on the Patreon source questions and pull in one from the second group, because it's related to this discussion. If we ignore economic arguments, could/should Scotland be an independent nation? Obviously, the way this is framed plays exactly to what I said about the Brexit vote. People who want to preserve the Union may well focus on the economic questions and all the other practical questions, but the vote for Scottish independence will only be won when the majority of Scots decide to define themselves as Scottish and not British. It will be identity, not pragmatism, ultimately. Should Scotland be an independent nation? Well, the unsatisfactory answer is if they want to be. And I think they need to show the settled will to wants to be for quite a significant period of time. Because the danger is, if you get a UK Prime Minister disliked by the majority in Scotland, as we have at the moment, and they base their decision on their dislike of that leader, which is a different flavour of pragmatism, there's nothing to guarantee you'll like the local leaders you end up with. So ultimately, it has to come down to your sense of identity and whether that's strong enough to overcome the practical difficulties you will be giving yourself by voting that way. The UK is no doubt going to have a tougher time on some of the fronts over the coming couple of years because of Brexit. And the people who voted for Brexit will say that's a price that they're willing to accept compared to the price that there would have been for staying. What I think you shouldn't do with Scotland, though, is to keep coming back and keep coming back and keep coming back until you get the answer you want. There should be a significant time to establish the settled will. Right now, Nicola Sturgeon got into some political difficulty and support for independence dipped. That rather makes you wonder about the nature of that support for independence. If it's tied to an individual popular politician, that's a pretty fragile basis for nation building. And if your nation currently has a pretty monopolistic one-state rule, as Scotland kind of does at the moment, I would be very careful, because that's exactly the situation you could end up with. Corruption and bad leadership follows one-party rules. Mallen, when it comes to the practicalities of moving forward in a more sustainable manner, you focus heavily on what works, which of course is the only way we should think about policy. But I feel you somewhat overlook personal responsibility. I understand that moralising about other people's decisions isn't a helpful way to bring about change, but I have a choice over what I do, and it's important to me that I don't make things worse. Do you not feel that we have a responsibility as informed citizens to reduce our personal contribution to a problem that could have grave outcomes, even if unilateral action plainly won't avert those outcomes? I am certainly a big supporter of personal responsibility in general. I don't think that I ignore it at all. But you're talking about sustainability specifically, and that discussion is often framed about people adopting lifestyle choices in lines with what they think should happen in terms of what they eat, whether they fly, and all those sorts of things. I agree that you should aim to live in line with your stated values and your beliefs. For me, the question is what those beliefs are and whether they're based on a correct reading of the situation. So I don't believe that you'll create a more sustainable system by telling people they're not allowed to do any of the things that make life a joyful experience, because it won't work, for one thing. And you shouldn't try to make it that way unless you have real evidence that there is no alternative. We don't have that evidence today, and we certainly didn't have it in the 1970s when we first got environmentalists going to those sorts of themes from personal preference. So personal responsibility in that context, for sure, means not doing things gratuitously to make things worse, but it also means not accepting the framing of people who put forward false solutions that won't work, even if it comes with moral pressure. But I may well amplify on some of the personal responsibility stuff in the future. You're right that we may have had too little focus on that in recent videos. Has fairness doctrine, balance, impartiality bitten the dust of the BBC? I don't think so. At least not yet. The new Director General Tim Davie is keen to re-establish balance, and he's done a few things that seem to suggest seriousness of intent. I'm inclined to give the benefit of the doubt, for a while at least. Bear in mind the BBC produces a huge output. It's very easy to jump onto the occasional lapse and to amplify it and imply it represents the whole, which is what people tend to do. Like the recent blow-up about Naga Munchetty and someone else sniggering about a government minister's Union Jack in the background. That things like that get attention is encouraging, because it means that such things haven't yet become so normalised that they're no longer news. That said, the woke culture influences are becoming so pervasive, I'm not sure how long the BBC will be able to hold out against them, even if it had greater willpower than we've seen to date. So, bitten the dust? Not yet. Watch this space. Under threat? You betcha. Then there was a related question about BBC funding. And that's entirely dependent, in my view, on Tim Davie's success. There is no case for a nation with a slight majority of somewheres paying for a de facto tax for episodes of Doctor Who that stop the action every 10 minutes to deliver election on racism or on climate change. If they can recapture the essence that made the BBC of value, then maybe the current form of funding can survive, but I suspect it's ultimately going to be for a slimmed down core that is specifically public service broadcasting. It'll be interesting to see how much of a dent Andrew Neil's GB News and the Rupert Murdoch version make when they appear. Now that's all the Patreon questions. Clearly not going to have time to go through all the ones remaining, but let's do a few as rapid fire as possible. What's your opinion of the police crime sentencing and courts bill, Mallen? I'm holding it in reserve. It passed second reading last week. It now moves to the committee stage. My understanding is that Libertarian Tories, amongst others, are going to be working hard at amending some of its weaknesses. So let's see what comes out of that committee stage. In principle, I can get why London police shouldn't have to put up with Extinction Rebellion blocking roads for 2 weeks at a time, camping out personally to disrupt everyone else. You've also got to do that in a way that preserves the absolute right to protest. My sense is that's the balance they're trying to achieve. The current version is too widely framed, but let's see what comes out of the process. Where does your name come from? I've never come across the name Mallen before. Well, I looked it up and it's apparently an Old English name. It means strong warrior. Oh, all right. It actually means little strong warrior. But, you know, strong. That's the important part. I've not come across it before either. I don't anticipate that the future success of this channel will lead to a wave of babies being given the name, but you never know. The whole COVID vaccination situation worries me. All this talk by 2030, a third of all jobs will be automated, plus there is also a pension crisis right now, so scary coincidence. There are so many doctors and scientists like Geert van den Bosch saying these mRNA vaccines will destroy our immunity. Can you help with this terrifying concern, please? Okay, there's a bunch of unrelated issues strung together there, and I can't do the whole thing justice in passing in a video like this. First of all, vaccination. The clinical trials and the real-world experience to date have shown no evidence to support that vaccines will destroy our immunity. One of the other questions I think refers to this because it asked me to talk about pathogenic priming, which is what I think you're referring to here. It would bear a video of its own. I'm not likely to be making that video because as far as I'm aware, if that fear had substance, we would know it by now. It would have shown up in the clinical trials, certainly would have shown up by now in the real world experience, and it hasn't. We have lots of history of vaccines. They work, they make things better. Now, none of that has anything to do with automation. And I wonder if you're tying this together with one of these all-encompassing sort of conspiracy theories, like the people behind the Great Reset who are supposedly doing nefarious things. Automation is a definite trend, and it's going to change our society significantly, as the Industrial Revolution changed our society and as the Computer Revolution changed our society. Again, this may well be a topic for a future video. And there are lots of serious parts to consider. Possible unintended consequences. Should you panic about it? I don't think so. For one thing, people always overestimated the impact of these changes. I remember in the 1980s people saying that the invention of computers would mean that we would all be working 2 or 3 day weeks and we would have lots of leisure time the rest of the time. And, you know, in reality, we all ended up working harder and longer than ever. Now, that may not be the case next time. The point is that people are really bad at predicting how these things play out. And some people are only too keen to catastrophize these trends because it gets them attention. And yes, some of those people are doctors. If there's a specific video you want me to respond to, then put a link in the comments below. But by and large, there are things to be concerned about, but not things that I would say you should be terrified about. Why is socialism so popular among young people and the universities, despite the record of history being crystal clear that it doesn't work? Well, look, it's always been the way. Socialism purports to care about justice and fairness and the environment, and how heartless would you have to be not to think that those were good things? And conservatives get called by socialists racists and sexists and homophobes, and how heartless would you have to be to want to make common cause with those people? As people grow up, they get more experience of the world. They see time and time again that those fine principles don't guarantee success when you attempt to put them into action. And then people start to become interested in questions about, well, maybe what actually works with the world the way that it is, not the way that we'd like it to be. But that comes with experience. It doesn't mean that they're always wrong, by the way, or that older people are always right. When systems fail, socialists are the ones who will point to those that have fallen between the cracks who need help. And they'll often also locate the true exploiters who use the system in ways that break society's ethical codes. It's just that historically every system they ever put into place went truly remorselessly and horribly wrong. That's not the history they get taught at school though, is it? Right now they're getting taught that everyone who came before them was a racist with no redeeming qualities whatsoever. Okay, final question. My apologies to the 7 that I've not had time to include. Hello, Mallen. Do you think this apparent climate of antagonism towards the UK from the EU is temporary, or does it foretell a serious continuing trend? To me, it looks like the second. Will we be the whipping boy for long? Yes and no is the answer that you've come to expect from me. There will always be a frisson between the UK and the continent. There always has been, for historical and cultural reasons. There'll be a bit more of an edge to that in the future, at least for the time being. The current higher levels of tension are largely because the EU is feeling deeply under threat right now. Its mission for ever closer union has been destabilised by Brexit, destabilised by the pandemic and especially the recent missteps. It is worried that one or two more fractious countries might decide to follow Britain's lead, and that might lead to a hemorrhaging of support, bringing the whole thing down. That's the nightmare scenario, and no one can take it for granted that it's not imminent, because such things can disentangle very quickly. If that doesn't happen, and if things gradually stabilise, then relations will ultimately improve. The EU's now being pushed back by China and Russia. Sooner or later, the geopolitics reassert themselves. Britain is one of the key players in NATO, is a committed champion of democracy, is committed to free markets and human rights. All of those things matter. And ultimately, the EU's moment where Macron said, well, maybe they didn't see so much difference between the US over there and China over here. Well, that's not going to hold. And we may be seeing evidence of that even this week. So ultimately, the fact that we have more in common than we have separating us is going to kick back in. But there's, wounded pride, and there are individual political careers at stake at the moment, so it's going to take a while. All right, that's all. Thanks so much for some very interesting questions. Let's continue the discussion in the comments below.